On the 23rd of August 1971, a well-respected lawyer from Virginia mailed a letter to his friend complaining about how hard it was becoming for American businesses to get anything done under the growing weight of endless new red tape, worker protections, and anti-corporate sentiments. Usually a high-end lawyer complaining about the problems his wealthy business clientele paid him to deal with wouldn't really be that interesting by itself. The difference was, though, that this letter also included a plan to fix these problems. Within 8 pages, one man outlined a lot of ideas that will probably sound eerily familiar to you today. He said that in order to put corporate interest back on top, they would have to work together to nudge the media, shape minds through education, capture the courts, create think tanks to tailor the truth, and, above all else, convince people that they were shareholders so that what was good for business was ultimately good for them. This still might not sound that crazy, except that both the man who sent this letter and the man who received it went on to fill positions where they could execute on this wish list of corporate interests. Now, this document was never meant to be seen by the general public, and even when it was made public by journalists a year later, it didn't really get that much attention because the ideas it set out simultaneously sounded too radical to be taken seriously and too subtle to have any real impact. But by exploring the difference between the economy and the business landscape back then, and the same fields today, it should become pretty clear to you that through meticulous and consistent execution by some of the most powerful names you've never heard of, this letter basically predicted the next half-century of politics and the almighty corporations positioned at the center of it.
Cigarettes and nicotine clearly do not meet the classic definitions of addiction.
When, as and if, any ingredient in cigarette smoke is identified,
it's a snowball, and that's just from outside here. So it's very, very cold out, very unseasonal. So, Mr. President, catch this.
Devastating was the half of it. I mean, maybe I got this wrong, but I thought companies lay off people when they've hit hard times.
Comes after then President Biden, in his farewell address, delivered a warning about what he called a dangerous concentration of power in the hands of a few very rich people.
Nearly 40% of households face a lower standard of living in retirement.
To understand why this letter was written in the first place, you need to understand what America looked like in 1971. And to put it bluntly, big corporate interests and wealthy asset owners were feeling just a little bit hard done by. The New Deal era had reshaped the relationship between business and government in America. Top marginal income tax rates were sitting at around 70%. Corporate tax rates were significantly higher than what we see today. And perhaps most importantly of all, regulators had real teeth. American union membership was nearing its all-time peak, and collective bargaining agreements meant that when a company made money, its workers expected to see some of that reflected in their wages. And they usually did. But it wasn't just the unions. A whole new wave of social movements was putting corporate America on the defensive in ways it had never experienced before. Rachel Carson's Silent Spring had helped kickstart the environmental movement in the early 1960s. Ralph Nader was making a career out of publicly humiliating the auto industry over safety standards. The newly created Environmental Protection Agency was writing rules that made it harder and more expensive to dump waste into rivers and pump pollutants into the air. Consumer protection laws were expanded, workplace safety regulations were tightened, and the public mood had shifted to a point where large corporations were viewed with genuine suspicion. Now, none of this is to say that the 1960s and early 70s were some kind of corporate Armageddon. American companies were still enormously profitable by any reasonable measure, but the shift was clear, and for people at the top of those companies, the trend lines were alarming. Every year seemed to bring a new regulation, a new agency, a new restriction on what businesses could do and how they could do it. Both parties, Republican and Democrat, broadly accepted the New Deal consensus. Arguing against labor protections or environmental regulation was political poison. Even Richard Nixon, who was nobody's idea of a progressive, signed the EPA into existence and supported workplace safety legislation. So from the perspective of corporate America, the system wasn't just hostile, it was a noose getting tighter with each passing year. And in a situation that might sound almost unthinkable today, nobody with any real power seemed to be on their side. So yeah, this was the world in the summer of 1971, when Lewis Powell sat down to write at his typewriter. Lewis Franklin Powell Jr. was not some marginal crank writing angry letters from his basement. He was one of the most respected corporate lawyers in the country, a partner at Hunt & Williams, Gay, Powell & Gibson in Richmond, Virginia, one of the oldest and most influential law firms in the American South. His client list read like a who's who of American industry. He had represented the tobacco industry for years, including sitting on the board of Philip Morris. He had advised major corporations on regulatory strategy. He was deeply embedded in the networks where corporate power and legal strategy overlapped. And critically, he knew how to make an argument. The man on the receiving end of this letter was Eugene Sydnor Jr., the chairman of the Education Committee at the United States Chamber of Commerce. Despite the very official sounding name and using words like the United States Chamber and Education Committee, the Chamber of Commerce is not a government agency. It was, and still is, essentially the largest lobbying organization for American business. A small side note, which is partially relevant to the rest of the story, is that this confusion is 100% intentional. The Chamber of Commerce deliberately tries to make itself look as official as possible to push its agenda to the point where even their office in DC could easily be mistaken for a government building. And at the time, one of its highest-ranking employees had specifically asked Powell to write something. The Chamber wanted a plan. They could see the same trends Powell could: rising regulation, hostile public opinion, empowered unions, and they wanted a coherent strategy for fighting back. So Powell delivered one. The document was officially titled Attack on American Free Enterprise System, and despite only being 8 pages long, it laid out what amounted to a comprehensive blueprint for reshaping American public life in favor of corporate interests. The word attack in the title is worth paying attention to. Powell didn't frame this as a policy disagreement. He framed it as a war. In his telling, the American free enterprise system was under coordinated assault from universities, the media, politicians, and activist groups. And business was losing because it had failed to fight back with the same level of organization. The memo's genius, if you want to call it that, was that it didn't propose anything illegal. It didn't call for bribes or threats or backroom deals. Everything it recommended could be done in broad daylight. The plan had several pillars. First, education. Powell looked at universities and basically decided that they were enemy territory. His solution was to fund pro-business academic positions, create new research centers, develop pro-free enterprise textbooks, and keep tabs on what was being taught. Second, media. Powell believed the national media had an inherent bias against business. His recommendation was for the corporate world to invest in its own media presence, funding publications, demanding equal airtime, and building an infrastructure of commentators who could shape public opinion. Third, the courts. Powell argued that the legal system was being used against business by activist lawyers and public interest groups. His counter-strategy was for corporate America to build its own legal infrastructure, funding litigation, filing amicus briefs, and cultivating lawyers and judges who would advance business interests from the bench. And fourth, politics. Powell didn't call it lobbying exactly, but the implication was clear. Business needed to pool resources and coordinate messages and engage with the political process with the same intensity as the movements challenging it. But underneath all of these pillars was a single unifying insight that made the whole thing work. Powell understood that a handful of large companies and their wealthy owners weren't going to win a political fight by winning elections. They had to win by changing the environment in which the elections took place. If you could shift what the universities teach, what the media covers, what the courts rule, and what the voters believe, then the elections take care of themselves. Now, there is a version of this story where the Powell memo gets filed away in a drawer somewhere, forgotten alongside every other strategic document that sounded bold on paper but never really went anywhere. This is very much not what happened. Instead, this 8-page letter triggered what might be the most successful and sustained corporate mobilization in American history. A mobilization so effective that it didn't just change policy, it changed what we believe. And the most remarkable thing about it was that almost nobody noticed it was happening. Regulations kept piling up, public trust in American institutions kept declining, workers kept losing ground, and the people responsible for it had been following a playbook written on a typewriter in Virginia during the summer of 1971. So it's time to learn how history works, and to find out how one 8-page letter quietly rewired American democracy, and why most people have still never heard of the document that did it. Hey you! If you love existential dread supported by statistical data, covering all of the dumbest stuff happening in the world of business, finance, and economics, then sign yourself up for our completely free newsletter, Compounded Daily. It has concise stories you should know blasted into your inbox whenever we happen to feel like writing about something worth writing about. It also has, an end, so you can replace your eternal morning doom scroll with a concise update and then get your ass up to do whatever it is you do in the morning. Sign up for free in the video description. And now let's get back to undermining the democratic system. Now, the first pillar to get built was arguably the most important one, because it was the one that made all the others possible: education. Not education in the traditional sense, but the creation of an entirely new intellectual infrastructure designed to produce ideas and research that favored corporate interests, and then push those ideas into the mainstream. Within a few years of the Powell memo's circulation, America's think tank landscape was transformed. The Heritage Foundation was founded in 1973 with seed money from Joseph Coors, the beer magnate, and Richard Mellon Scaife, an heir to the Mellon banking and oil fortune. Its mission was explicitly to influence policy from the right, and it was extraordinarily good at it. The Cato Institute followed in 1977, funded in large part by the industrialist Charles Koch. The American Enterprise Institute, which had existed since 1938 but had been relatively obscure, was dramatically expanded and repositioned as a heavyweight conservative policy shop. The trick with these organizations was that they looked academic. They published papers, they held conferences, they hired people with PhDs. But their funding overwhelmingly came from corporate donors and wealthy individuals with very specific policy interests. Lower taxes, less regulation, weaker unions, and reduced government spending. And this is where Powell's insight really paid off. If a corporate CEO stands up and says, "We should cut our taxes," nobody takes it seriously because the motivation is transparent. But if a well-funded think tank publishes a 200-page paper with footnotes arguing that tax cuts stimulate economic growth, well, that gets cited in congressional testimony. It gets picked up by journalists. It becomes part of the conversation. The messenger matters as much as the message. Alongside the think tanks, corporate money flowed into universities. Organizations like the Olin Foundation spent hundreds of millions funding programs to shift the intellectual center of gravity in law schools towards market-friendly perspectives. Student organizations were seeded on campus. Internship pipelines were created. A recruitment ecosystem was built, and it worked. By the 1980s, the intellectual case for deregulation, privatization, and free market economics wasn't coming from fringe outsiders anymore. It was coming directly from America's top universities: Harvard, Chicago, and Stanford. It had the imprimatur of serious scholarship, and it had been built brick by brick, exactly as Powell had recommended. The second pillar was the media. In 1971, the American media landscape was genuinely hostile territory for big business. Investigative journalism was having a golden age. Reporters were breaking stories about corporate malfeasance and environmental damage and unsafe products with genuine public support. The Powell memo was explicit about this. Business needed its own voice in the media, and it needed to be loud enough to compete with the critics. The initial response was modest. Corporate-funded magazines, sponsored opinion columns, industry groups developing more sophisticated public relation strategies. But over time, and I mean over time, something much larger emerged. Conservative talk radio exploded in the late 1980s after the repeal of the Fairness Doctrine in 1987, a regulation that had required broadcasters to present balanced coverage of controversial political topics. Once that guardrail was removed, there was nothing to stop stations from running politically one-sided programming all day, every day. So they did. Rush Limbaugh's show launched nationally in 1988 and became the template for an entire genre of conservative media. Fox News followed in 1996. By the end of the decade, an entire ecosystem of opinion media had emerged around us, funded by, sympathetic to, and operationally aligned with corporate interests. Now, to be fair, Powell didn't predict talk radio or cable news in 1971. Nobody did. But what he did predict was that corporate America needed to invest in shaping public opinion through the media. And the infrastructure built in response to that call was waiting and ready when those new platforms appeared. The pipeline had already been built. The new media formats just gave it a wider mouth. And the result was a shift in how we all received information about economics, labor, and regulation. The idea that government regulation was inherently wasteful, that unions were corrupt, that the free market was the most efficient allocator of resources, these weren't new ideas, but they had never before been broadcast this relentlessly, this consistently, this effectively. Now, the third pillar of the Powell memo was the courts. And this is arguably where the long-term strategy produced its most consequential results. Powell understood something that most people at the time did not appreciate. The courts are not neutral arbiters. They are institutions staffed by human beings with philosophical frameworks and ideological commitments. And if you can influence who sits on the bench, you can shape the law for decades. His recommendation was straightforward. Fund legal organizations that bring cases to expand business rights. Train lawyers who share a pro-business philosophy, and work to ensure sympathetic judges are appointed to the federal bench. The most significant institutional response came in 1982 with the founding of the Federalist Society. Established by conservative law students at Yale and the University of Chicago who believed the legal establishment had drifted too far to the left, it grew into the single most important pipeline for federal judicial appointments in the United States. It doesn't just recommend judges, it cultivates them, identifying promising conservative legal minds early in their careers, providing networking opportunities, and creating a community of professionals who share a particular view of the Constitution. Every single Republican-appointed Supreme Court justice since the 1990s has been a member of, or closely affiliated with, the Federalist Society. Every single one. When a Republican president needs to fill a judicial vacancy, the Federalist Society effectively provides the shortlist. I mean, just look at what happened next. The Citizens United decision in 2010, which ruled that corporations had the same free speech rights as individuals and could spend unlimited amounts of money on political campaigns, was decided by a court that included justices who had come up through exactly the legal infrastructure which the Powell memo had called for. The erosion of union power through judicial decisions, the expansion of corporate rights, the narrowing of regulatory authority. All of these trends can be traced, at least in part, to a legal movement built deliberately over decades with corporate money and strategic patience. And the irony of all ironies, 2 months after Lewis Powell submitted his memo to the Chamber of Commerce, Richard Nixon nominated him to the United States Supreme Court. Powell took his seat on the bench in January 1972, less than 6 months after writing a confidential strategy document about how corporate America should reshape the courts. Now, it should be said that there is no evidence Nixon knew about the memo when he made the nomination. Powell was a respected establishment lawyer with moderate-seeming credentials. He was confirmable, he was safe. But the result was that the man who had literally written the playbook for corporate capture of the judiciary was now sitting on the highest court in the land, and his jurisprudence reflected it. Powell authored the majority opinion in First National Bank of Boston versus Bellotti in 1978, a landmark case which established for the first time that corporations had First Amendment rights to spend money influencing ballot initiatives. This was the legal foundation stone that would eventually lead to Citizens United 3 decades later. He consistently voted to limit government regulatory authority and expand corporate legal protections. He was instrumental in shifting the court's interpretation of the 14th Amendment, an amendment originally written to protect the rights of freed slaves, to increasingly protect the rights of corporations. The man who wrote the memo was now executing it from the most powerful legal position in the country, and almost none of us connected the dots. The fourth and final pillar of the memo was political engagement, and this is where the money really started flowing. Before the Powell memo, Corporate political spending was relatively uncoordinated. Individual companies lobbied for their own specific interests, but there was nothing resembling a unified corporate political strategy. That changed rapidly. The number of corporations with registered lobbies in Washington went from around 175 in 1971 to over 2,400 by 1982. Corporate political action committees exploded from just 89 in 1974 to over 1,200 by the early 1980s. The Business Roundtable was founded in 1972, bringing together CEOs of the largest American corporations to coordinate on policy. The Chamber of Commerce itself was massively expanded. Trade associations became more aggressive and more politically sophisticated, and the revolving door between government and industry accelerated. Former regulators took jobs at companies they had been overseeing. Corporate executives moved into government to shape the rules that applied to their former employers. And all of this corporate mobilization arrived at exactly the right moment in American history. The stagflation of the 1970s, the oil crisis, the general sense of economic malaise, all of it eroded public confidence in the government's ability to manage the economy. And the corporate think tanks that had been built in the wake of the Powell memo were right there with a ready-made alternative narrative. Government wasn't the solution to the problem, government was the problem. That line, which Ronald Reagan would later make famous, didn't come from nowhere. It was the product of a decade of deliberate, well-funded, intellectual infrastructure building. The people who took Powell's 8-page memo and turned it into a political movement. What makes the Powell memo genuinely remarkable is not any single one of these developments in isolation. Think tanks have always existed, media has always been political, courts have always been contested. What makes it remarkable is that one man saw all of these fronts as part of a single coordinated strategy, and that strategy was executed with an almost eerie level of faithfulness over the following decades. The results speak for themselves. American union membership fell from roughly 30% in the early 1970s to under 11% today. The top marginal income tax rate dropped from around 70% to under 40%. Corporate tax rates were slashed. Financial regulation was stripped back. And the share of national income going to the top 1% nearly doubled. The shareholder value doctrine, the idea that a corporation's only obligation is to maximize returns for its shareholders, went from being a fringe academic argument in the 1970s to the dominant operating philosophy of corporate America by the 1990s. This doctrine did something that Powell would have absolutely loved. It gave executives a moral framework for doing exactly what they already wanted to do. Cutting wages, outsourcing jobs, fighting unions, resisting regulation. None of this was selfishness anymore. It was fiduciary duty. It was good management. It was what the shareholders demanded. And because an increasing number of the rest of us had been encouraged to invest our retirement savings into the stock market through 401k plans, the narrative that what was good for business was good for everybody else actually had a grain of truth to it. Your pension was now tied to corporate profits. Your retirement depended on stock prices going up. So when a company laid off workers to boost its share price, well, that affected your retirement, didn't it? This was perhaps the most elegant part of the whole strategy. You didn't need to convince people that corporations deserved more power. You just needed to make sure their financial futures were intertwined with corporate performance. And the politics would follow. It would be genuinely unfair to attribute all of these changes to one 8-page letter. The Powell memo did not single-handedly create the conservative movement. It did not invent lobbying or cause globalization. But here's the thing. What it did do was provide a framework, a coherent one, something that unified all of these scattered, reactive corporate responses into a single, coordinated strategy, and a devastatingly effective one at that. The Heritage Foundation didn't need the Powell memo to exist, but the memo created the intellectual climate that made the Heritage's brand of policy advocacy mainstream. Ronald Reagan didn't need a memo to tell him that government regulation was bad for business, but the network of think tanks, media outlets, and donor organizations that helped get him elected and then staffed his administration, that network was built by people who had read the memo, or who had been funded by people who had read it. or who had been trained in institutions that were created because of it. Powell didn't design a conspiracy, he designed an ecosystem. And if you want proof that the ecosystem is still running, you don't need to look any further than the last decade. The same think tanks are still publishing. The same legal networks are still placing judges. The same lobbying infrastructure is still shaping legislation. When the richest technology executives in the country lined up behind a presidential candidate in 2024, they weren't doing anything Lewis Powell wouldn't have recognized. They were doing exactly what he recommended. The difference is that in 1971, business had to build its political infrastructure from scratch. Today, that infrastructure is so deeply embedded that most of us don't even see it as infrastructure anymore. It's just how things work. American universities teach market economics as baseline truth. The media frames deregulation as common sense. The courts treat corporate spending as protected speech. And we evaluate our own economic well-being based on a stock market that primarily benefits the wealthiest 10% of the population. That didn't happen by accident. Now, it's worth asking the question that the memo itself never really addressed. Was any of this good? For the executives and shareholders who benefited from lower taxes, weaker unions, and friendly courts, obviously, yes. Corporate profits as a share of GDP reached levels not seen since the 1920s. For the rest of us, real wages have barely budged since the 1970s when adjusted for inflation. The cost of housing, healthcare, and education has risen dramatically faster than wages. Economic mobility has declined. Defenders of the free market revolution will point out that consumer goods have gotten cheaper and the economy has grown enormously. All of that is true, but if the economy has grown this much and the average person's situation has improved this little, where did all the growth go? As we covered in our video on inequality, it went almost entirely to the top. The gains were real, they just weren't shared. And whether you think that's a natural outcome of market forces or the deliberate result of a 50-year strategy to redistribute power upward probably depends on whether you've read the memo. So, the Powell memo started as one lawyer's strategy document for one lobbying organization, and it quietly became the operating manual for one of the most consequential political transformations in modern American history. It didn't promise revolution. It promised something more patient and more effective. A slow, methodical reshaping of the institutions that determine what we learn, what we hear, what our courts decide, and what we believe. The crazy thing is, the ideas in that letter didn't sound radical at the time. They didn't even sound particularly interesting. But the people who got that memo took it seriously. They didn't just read it, they built it, brick by brick. And over the next half-century, they executed on basically every page of it, with a level of success that Lewis Powell himself probably never imagined. Now, the most important lesson from the Powell memo might actually be the simplest one. We tend to think of politics as something that happens during election cycles, campaigns, debates, votes, memes, that kind of stuff. But the Powell memo understood that the real politics, the politics that determines what our options are on that ballot and what solutions are treated as credible, that happens long before anyone casts a vote. It happens in classrooms, in newsrooms, in courtrooms, and in boardrooms. And the people who understood that earliest, they won, regardless of whether or not the rest of us even realized we were playing. So if you want to see what happened when the political conditions created by the Powell memo finally found their perfect presidential candidate, go watch our video on Ronald Reagan next. And if you want to understand how the inequality that this system produced has compounded over the decades, check out our video on why inequality only ever gets worse. And don't forget to like and subscribe to keep on learning how history works.